The title of my talk is Decoding the Heavens, Solving the Mystery of the World's First Computer. And this is what I'm here to talk about, basically. This is the largest surviving piece of the Antikythera mechanism. It's an ancient machine from ancient Greece. It's about 2,000 years old, and it was found in a shipwreck about 100 years ago. And I'm just going to tell you really about, it's taken 100 years to work out what this thing was. You can see from looking at it that this is actually quite a complicated thing. You can see gear wheels here. There's a big four-spoked gear wheel with little triangular teeth around the edge. You can see lots of other wheels underneath this. So basically, I'm going to tell you about how this thing was discovered, about the 100 years of research that's gone into it since then, what we can say about what it did, you know, why it was built, who by, where it came from. Some of these questions we can answer better than others. This is still an ongoing project. And then what I think is one of the most interesting questions, what happened to this technology? Once the Greeks had achieved this kind of ability to build this kind of mechanism, why was that lost? Where did that knowledge go? So I'm going to take you back to the year 1900 in the Mediterranean. Sponge diving was a thriving industry in the Mediterranean back then. Sponge divers have been earning a living in the Mediterranean for thousands of years, since before Homer's time. All that time they'd been diving naked, weighed down by a stone, harvesting the sponges, coming back up. But in the 1860s, that all changed because these suits were brought in. So rubber and canvas heavy suits with this big bronze helmet on the top, and they were breathing compressed air that was fed through an air hose from the boat above. And this completely transformed the industry. They could go down deeper, they could stay down longer, they were bringing back huge hauls of sponges, but it was also deadly because they didn't understand the effect that the nitrogen was having on their bodies, so tens of thousands of them actually died during this period. And it's kind of during the height of this that Captain Demetrios Kontos and his crew of divers were making their way back from their sponge diving grounds here off the coast of North Africa. What tended to happen was all the sponge divers would go out in the spring and they'd spend 6 months living on their tiny little boats, harvesting sponges, and then in the autumn they'd bring them all back to a huge celebration, those of them that survived anyway. So it was autumn 1900, and they were heading back to their home, which was the island of Symi in the east here. But when they got to about here, they hit a storm and were blown off course, and they took shelter by Antikythera, which is a tiny barren islet. There's about 40 people live on it, almost uninhabited. And it's about halfway between Crete and the southern tip of mainland Greece. And so they waited for the storm waters to abate. A couple of days later, when it was all calm, one of the divers went down to the bottom. 5 minutes later, came rushing back up to the surface, kind of shaking with fear. They kind of hauled him onto the boat, hauled off his helmet, and he starts gabbling about how he's seen this heap of dead naked women on the seabed. So the captain kind of heads straight down to see what's going on, and he realizes that this isn't a pile of naked women. This is a pile of ancient statues. These are bronze and marble statues from an ancient shipwreck. And it turned out to be, they were subsequently hired by the Greek government to salvage this shipwreck. It was the first shipwreck that was ever salvaged by archaeologists, so it's quite a historic wreck in its own right. And what they found turned out to be the greatest haul of ancient treasure that anyone had ever come across up until that point. All the finds were taken back to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, caused great excitement in Athens and across Europe, headlines around the world. All of the staff extremely excited and busy. A lot of things are coming back in pieces. They're trying to fit them together, trying to work out what everything is. This is one of the most impressive things that came out of it. This is a statue that's been dubbed the Antikythera Youth. It's a bit larger than life size. Dates from probably the 4th or 5th century BC, made of bronze. One of the finest statues from that period that we have still today. Here's another one, a marble statue this time, and it shows you the effects of the seawater. So half of this statue was buried in the sand and was protected from the sea, and then this half was exposed to the seawater, and it just shows you what 2,000 years under the sea will do to you. And this is one of my favourites. This is a head of a philosopher. It's thought to be a portrait head of a particular philosopher. Unfortunately, we don't know which one. Again, made of bronze, and the eyes are just inlaid with stone. A lot of their statues had that feature. You kind of imagine that all of these things are coming back, and it's these incredible treasures that the staff are trying to piece together, and things that they don't know what they are, sort of bits that are unidentified, just basically got chucked into a courtyard, or crates in an open courtyard, and basically left there until someone had time to make sense of them. And there was one particular piece of rock that didn't really look like very much, that no one paid any attention to until a few months later when it cracked open. We're not sure if it sort of dried and shrunk and that made it crack open, or whether someone hit it with a hammer to find out what was inside. But what was inside was this. And so this was completely different to anything else that had come from the shipwreck. All the rest of it was, these glorious treasures, but it was kind of what you would expect to find from the ancient Greek world. Whereas this is different. This has got gear wheels, as I was showing you before. That was the largest piece. This is another piece, and you can see there's concentric, or the dials here that look like concentric circles. With there's a sort of bracket here. And here's another piece. This one I really like, because you can see there's two dials here and they're marked. I don't know if you can see those markings, but it looks like you might see today on a compass or a circular protractor or something. It looks very modern. And here you can see inscriptions on it in ancient Greek. So this is some sort of, if I go back, it's some sort of machine. It's clockwork. It's clearly gear wheels that were engaging together. There are pointers there, dials, inscriptions. So this is nothing like anything else that had ever been found from the ancient world, and nothing like anything else that we have since found. Not one single gear wheel apart from this has ever been found from the ancient world, and this has at least 30. No other example of a precisely marked scale like this has ever been found from the ancient world. So we have kind of hints from text, but in terms of physical objects, this is completely on its own. So obviously everyone was extremely excited. Experts were brought from all over Europe to kind of try and work out what on earth this thing was. One of them was called Pericles Rediadis, and he said, "To the antiquities brought up from the bottom of the sea at Antikythera belongs a completely strange instrument whose purpose and use are unknown. It is nevertheless very similar to the gear wheel system of a simple modern clock." And I think he's right. When you look at the clockwork, that is, well, when I saw it in the museum, it's what I thought of first, was kind of, it looked like the inside of an alarm clock or a watch or something like that. There are all kinds of theories floating around as to what this thing could have been. I mean, you saw the state of it. It's completely battered. It's really hard to tell what on earth it was. But one theory was that it was an astrolabe. Probably most of you know what an astrolabe is, but it's kind of a simple device that was really popular in medieval times, kind of two metal discs, one rotating over the other. One represents a map of the sky, and then the top one represents like the position of the sun and the stars, so you can rotate them to kind of compute the astronomical positions. But it doesn't have any gear wheels in it, it's just two rotating discs. So the idea that it was an astrolabe seemed a little bit strange. Some people thought it was a hoax, some people thought it was a more modern device, like a planetarium or something that had either someone had dropped it on the wreck site by chance, or had been put there to confuse people. Basically nobody could really make head or tail of it. They figured that it had some kind of astronomical or navigational purpose, but that's about as far as they got. I should say that situation pretty much carried on up until the Second World War, when the Antikythera mechanism, the surviving pieces of it, and also most of the contents of the National Archaeological Museum were all buried under the floor of the museum to save them from invading Nazi troops. So there's quite an interesting story there about what happened to the contents of the whole museum. After the Second World War, they were dug up again, put back on display. But the Antikythera fragments kind of were forgotten still, because they didn't really fit with what people thought about ancient Greek. Nobody knew what to make of them. No one knew whether this was a hoax or whether they were real. So they kind of just got left in a crate again, and nobody really paid very much attention until this man. He's called Derek de Sawyer Price. He was born in the East End of London in the 1920s, and he was trained as a physicist at the University of London. But then he went to Cambridge and did a second PhD in the history of science. And his speciality was scientific instruments, perhaps because he trained as a physicist originally and knew the importance of scientific instruments. And for him, the whole key to the progress of science is in the development of the technology and the instruments are used. He kind of felt like, yeah, you can have amazing scientific brains, you can do all this abstract theoretical work, but if you haven't actually got the machines and the instruments to take the measurements, then you're not going to get anywhere with your science. So that was where he was coming from. While he was at Cambridge, he discovered a manuscript it was just it was sitting in one of the libraries there. It was to do with astronomy. It was instructions for how to use an instrument called an equatorium, which is a bit like an astrolabe, but a little bit more complicated, and it enables you to compute positions of the planets. And it had been attributed to a not very well-known astronomer called Simon Breeden in the 14th century. But when Derek Price looked at it, he realized that Simon Breeden had actually died before some of the observations in this manuscript had been made, so it couldn't have been written by him. So he looked at it more carefully, and he found this one little note at the bottom of one of the pages, and it said Radix Chaucer. And Radix is the reference date that astronomers use to compare all of their other observation dates against. And he came to the conclusion that this manuscript had actually been written by Chaucer. Which isn't as weird as it sounds, because the one sort of non-literary manuscript that we know that Chaucer wrote was actually instructions for the use of the astrolabe, which he'd written for his son. So it might make sense that he had written this as well. And it's kind of very scruffily written with crossings out all over it, so it doesn't look like something that somebody else has copied. It actually looks as if this is the original that was written sort of by that astronomer before it was then later copied by scribes in sort of more smart versions. And if it was by Chaucer, it would be the only extensive sample of his handwriting in existence. So that was a pretty amazing find. And scholars are still arguing today, actually, over whether he was right or not. It hasn't been completely proved, but no one's been able to disprove it either. There's quite a lot of evidence that he might well have been right. So that's 14th century. That's Equatoria. Shortly after that, he had a paper in the science journal Nature. So this is the 1950s we're talking about. And this is a Chinese clock tower. This was described in the 10th century AD by a tutor to the emperor called Su Song. It was a huge tower, and it was driven by water, pressing the wrong button. So there's a water wheel here, and then that drove all kinds of astronomical displays. So there was an armillary sphere at the top, which is a bit like a three-dimensional version of an astrolabe. It's kind of a three-dimensional sky map. There was a sphere showing the constellations that was going around, and also it drove little figures that would sort of strike bells on the hour. And this was interesting because before this, European historians had kind of assumed that mechanical sort of modern clocks, all of the technology that went into that was developed in medieval Europe, just kind of from scratch. They just came up with it all. But by looking at documents from China, what Price showed was that actually a lot of this technology was around elsewhere a lot earlier than that. So you had very simple gearing in this clock tower, but also this water wheel. The way that so basically what would happen is these were little buckets, and they would all hold a set amount of water. So the water would come in at a constant rate, and it would fill up the little trough, and then when a certain amount of water filled the trough, then it would get to the right weight to pull the wheel around another step. And that's like and that's basically it's like a non-mechanical version of giving you the clock's ticks. So what's really important in a mechanical clock is the ability, say you've wound it up or it's driven by a weight or whatever, but you need to convert that constant force into a series of regular ticks in order for your clock to run. It's called the escapement, and it's a key thing for inventing the clock. But here's a kind of escapement in China back in the 10th century AD. So he's kind of going further and further back and just showing that certain pieces of knowledge were around before the sort of mainstream historians thought they had been. Something else he looked at, this is the Tower of the Winds. I don't know if any of you have been to see this. It's in Athens. And it's an octagonal marble tower. It dates from about the 1st or 2nd century BC, and it's unusual. It's one of the few buildings from that time that still stands intact. It even has its roof on it, I think. And it's called the Tower of the Winds because on each of the 8 sides, these are the sort of figures representing the 8 winds. And originally there would have been a weather vane on the top that pointed to the particular appropriate wind god. And you can't really see in this picture, but there are sundials that are carved on these faces as well. Inside, however, it's completely gutted. But from ancient writings there are hints that this once held a gigantic water clock. But because there's nothing really inside, everyone had kind of given up on trying to work out actually what this thing was. But so Derek Price came along, and he decided that there's basically some grooves in the floor and there's some marks on the wall, and he said, right, well, this is just like trying to work out what the layout of a modern kitchen from, if you take out all the units and you see the marks on the floor and you see the plug sockets, you can work out what had gone where. And he decided that he just had to apply exactly the same principle to this. And he knew from writings at the time the kinds of water clocks that they had. And he was able to reconstruct what was inside this tower. And it was actually a huge water clock where a simple gear was used. So the water came in, and it would have been a float as the water level rose in a particular vessel, and that was connected to a gear that then turned a huge flat bronze disc that represented the sky. So it's a little bit like an astrolabe, but being turned by a water clock. So you're seeing that basically the sky is turning on this disc behind a grid of fixed hour lines, and then there's a peg for the sun that goes around on the disc. So by looking at it, you can tell the time, but you can also basically see that the whole of the heavens turning sort of in time with the way that they do actually in the real sky. And it would have been a huge demonstration piece, and there were fountains and there were figures, and it would have been the centre of the Greek Athens marketplace. So basically he's following kind of back in time these kind of astronomical devices, clock technology, sort of simple gearing. But then he heard about something that was older than any of these things and far, far more sophisticated than any of these things, the Antikythera mechanism. And he basically felt that was kind of the key to everything, that this was the beginning of all of these strands of technology that had then sort of led through to a lot of these machines that seem so familiar to us today. So he wrote about it in a few popular magazines at the time. This is what he said. If it is genuine, the Antikythera machine must entail a complete re-estimation of ancient Greek technology. Its discovery 55 years ago was as spectacular as if the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb had revealed the decayed but recognisable parts of an internal combustion engine. Because this is something that nobody had heard of at the time. Nobody was paying any attention to. He'd sort of uncovered these early papers from when it was first found, sort of during his research. But really still nobody paid very much attention to him because, he didn't really have any evidence for this. There were just these battered pieces and people could look at them and say, well, that could be anything. So he realised that he was going to have to go to Athens for himself. So he went there and he worked with an epigrapher who lived in Athens. And the first thing he did was to try to read some of the inscriptions. And you could only read little fragments, just snatches, but these are some of the things that he was able to read. So Pacon and Payne, I don't know if you remember from the picture I showed you earlier of this kind of two circular dials, one inside the other, and they had those very precise markings on them. Pacon and Payne come from the outer one, and they are months from the Greek form of the ancient Egyptian calendar. And you could tell from the spacing that this dial was divided into roughly 12. So this dial is basically giving you the 12 months of the year. And then just in the inner dial, at the same part at the top, you could just see Kelai and Parthenos. So most of the rest of the dial doesn't survive. But these are signs of the zodiac in Greek. Kelai is Libra, and Parthenos is Virgo. So this is giving you the 12 signs of the zodiac. So it's basically representing the sky. If you had a pointer that goes around this dial, it would represent the movement of the sun through the sky. So going through the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 12 months of the year. So one revolution of a pointer around that dial would represent 1 year. So he's starting to think, okay, this is some kind of calendar. He called it a calendar computer. So he's still no closer to knowing what's going on inside, but he's starting to get a sense of kind of what sort of thing was this. So also written on the front were things like Vega rises in the evening, the Hyades set in the morning, Gemini begins to rise. And these are very similar to things that you see in a type of ancient Greek calendar called a parapegma. And these are basically star calendars, and they tell you what the stars are doing at different times of year. Often they'd be written out in a list, and you'd have you'd have holes next to them all. And then you'd have like a peg that you would move from hole to hole, like once every day or once every 2 days. And it's telling you what the stars are doing. And it was really important for agriculture. So you'd be looking to see, well, which stars are rising and setting at dawn or dusk. And then you'd compare against your calendar, and it would be telling you what crops you needed to be planting at that time. Or for the Egyptians, it was very important to be able to predict the flooding of the Nile, for example. So it was a way in which they kind of kept tabs on the solar year. So obviously... again, it's something to do with some kind of calendar. And then on the back were things like 2 pointers whose ends carry the sun's rays, ecliptic, Venus. It's all very tantalising. You can't really see exactly what's going on, but it looks like operating instructions. So that's how far he got with the inscriptions. But he wasn't really able to get much further with the actual functioning of it. I mean, you saw the state of the fragments, and they're, beyond saying, oh, there are some gear wheels, I mean, there's not really much more you can say. Until in the 1970s, so this is about 20 years later, he's still working on this thing, but he hears about a technique of using X-rays and gamma rays to look inside objects of archaeological or artistic importance without destroying them. So this is still very new technology, but he works with a radiographer in Athens to X-ray the pieces. And this is an X-ray of that biggest piece, the one I showed you first of all with the 4-spoked wheel. So it's not amazing quality, but straight away you can see lots more wheels that are hidden inside and dials here. So what he wants to do here is he wants to look at the arrangement of the wheels, but the most important thing is to count the number of teeth on those wheels, because he wants to know the mathematical ratios that are being calculated when one gear wheel engages with another. Because if you can actually get the numbers sorted, then you can start to say, okay, what's the maths that's being done here? What are the equations that are being calculated by the gear wheels in this thing? So he took all his X-rays and he went back to, he was working at Yale at this point, and he went back and worked feverishly on them all, and these are some of the little cardboard models that he made, trying to work out how on earth all the pieces fitted together. He was sort of starting to develop a model where here's the front, where you've got these 2 dials, one inside the other, showing you the 12 months of the year and the signs of the zodiac, and then on the back he thought there was one dial above the other, looked like concentric circles, and he's trying to sort of work out some of the different segments that they're divided into, and here he's trying to model some of the gear wheels inside. And this is the gearing diagram that he came up with. I'm not going to go through it wheel by wheel, but it gives you a sense of how complicated this thing was. And actually there's very good evidence that we don't have the whole thing, so this is just part of it. But it was basically, it was encased in a wooden box about the size of a sort of clock that you might have standing on your mantelpiece, with the 1 dial on the front, 2 dials on the back, and all of the gear wheels inside, a bit like a clock. And it would have been turned by a handle on the side that would have turned a crown wheel that then drove the big wheel, and all the other wheels were driven from there. And he thought that it was basically all about the sun and the moon. So both of these things are very important to the ancient Greeks, obviously. So the sun, solar cycle, the solar year, very important for agriculture, what you're planting when. But the moon was basically what drove most of their religious calendars, and religious festivals were generally timed to the moon. So both calendars were very important to them. Unfortunately, you don't get a neat number of lunar months fitting into a solar year, so it's quite hard to reconcile the two. So it was very important to the Greeks to have calendars that could keep track of both of them, make sense of both cycles. So now, for example, our calendar just follows the sun. It's completely lost track of the moon. Full moon, new moon can happen pretty much at any time in the month. But what the Greeks knew, and they probably learned this from the Babylonian priest astronomers who'd been observing the sort of sun and movements of the sun and the moon for centuries, was that you don't have an exact number of lunar months in one solar year, but you have very close to an exact number of lunar months in 19 solar years. And this was called the Metonic cycle, after a Greek astronomer called Meton, who was the first Greek to use it, although, as I said, he probably got it from the Babylonians. And so 235 synodic months is equal to 254 sidereal months is equal to 19 years. So a synodic month is what we would normally think of as a lunar month. So that's full moon to full moon, or new moon to new moon. A sidereal month is one sidereal month is the time it takes for the moon to go from a particular point in the sky against the background stars, orbit the Earth exactly once, and come back to exactly the same point against those background stars. So those aren't the same, because the synodic month, that's measuring the phase of the moon, and that depends on the position not just of the moon relative to the Earth, but the position of the Earth relative to the sun as well. So that's why it takes slightly longer, because the moon needs to go once around the Earth, but then because the Earth has moved around the sun in that time, the moon needs to go a little bit further around for you to come back to exactly the same phase. But give or take a couple of hours, 235 sonic months, 254 sidereal months, 19 years. That's one cycle, and then everything comes back to the same position, and you can start that cycle again. So that metonic cycle was extremely important to the Greeks. So what Derek Price did is he looked at first of all, he looked at the gear wheels that were leading from, so you had a handle on the side turning it. What were the first gear wheels that led from that initial? So you're driving probably the sun pointer that's going around this dial once a year, and then there was a train of 6 gear wheels, so 3 pairs that were leading from that, and he wanted to know, well, what's that calculating? So he looked at the number of gears on those 6 gear wheels. I don't know how much sense that's going to make, so I'll just try and explain that quickly. So basically, when you have gears that are driving each other, you can calculate mathematical ratios. So if you imagine a gear wheel that has 10 teeth, and it's turning a gear wheel that has 20 teeth, every time you turn that first 10-tooth gear wheel once, the second gear wheel with 20 teeth is going to turn half a turn. Does that make sense? And you can write that as a fraction, so 10 over 20 or 1 over 2. So that's basically the maths that all of this is based on. So that's an extremely simple example, but you can use gear wheels with different numbers of wheels, and you can build up different pairs. And this is basically how it's written, and that's how the maths works out. So he had 3 pairs, 64 teeth, 38 teeth, 48 teeth, 24 teeth, 107 teeth, 32 teeth. And when you do the maths, ultimately the ratio that's being calculated is 254 over 19. So for every 19 turns of that first sun pointer, you're calculating a speed of 254 turns. So what it's basically doing is it's calculating the speed of the moon from the speed of the sun. So then that's driving a second pointer that shows you the moon going around that main dial that represents the sky. So this is how it looks, basically. So you've got your wooden box, you've got your handle on the side to turn it with, and your 2 dials, and then you've got your sun pointer going around once a year, and your moon pointer going around at the speed of the moon, and then there are sort of star calendar inscriptions going on down here. But he didn't stop there. He carried on, and he saw a cluster of gear wheels that was being carried around on a bigger turntable, on another bigger wheel. And he thought that what this was a differential gear. Our differential gear is actually a really complicated piece of gearing where you've got generally 2 inputs and 1 output that are carried around on a turntable, and the output is dependent on the relative speed of these 2 inputs. What it basically does is that I can add and subtract. I'm not going to try and explain exactly how that works, but it's kind of lots of things moving relative to each other. It's very difficult to visualize. It was thought that hadn't been invented until at least the 17th century, when it was used in astronomical clocks. So that really would have been just an incredible find. Price was very, very excited about it. And the 2 inputs that he followed were the speed of the sun, the speed of the moon. They were being fed into this differential gear in such a way that he thought they were being subtracted 254 minus 19, so the moon's motion minus the sun's motion. What gives you is 235, the synodic month. That's the phase of the moon. So it's calculating the phase of the moon from those 2 original speeds. So at this, Price just thought, wow, I've got it, I've solved it. He thought that this was fed through and then displayed on one of the dials on the back. He didn't know why that dial would have then needed 5 concentric dials to show that one thing. He didn't really know what the other dial on the back did, but he didn't care, he'd solved it. He wrote a 70-page paper on it in 1974, extremely long, extremely tedious, but like detailing all of this. And also saying that, how significant that he thought this was, how, this completely rewrote the history of what the Greeks were able to do, because they shouldn't have been able to do any of this gearing. The idea that they had actually made a clockwork computer was incredible. So he wrote this paper, and he had some fans. Arthur C. Clarke got to know Derek Price, and he featured the Antikythera mechanism in his TV series Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, and he wrote about it and spoke about it from time to time. And he said, if the ancient Greeks had been able to build on their knowledge, the Industrial Revolution might have begun more than a millennium ago. By this time, we would not merely be pottering around on the moon, we would have reached the nearest stars. Which is quite thought-provoking. Because this is basically, this clockwork technology is what sort of directly fed into the scientific revolution and then the industrial revolution. So a differential gear, for example, was really key in sort of spinning technology, when they were industrializing sort of spinning yarn, it was a key part of the sort of machinery that went into that. And then later it was used in cars. It was still used in cars, so that when you turn the steering wheel, both of the wheels don't turn by exactly the same amount. As you're turning the corner, you need the outer wheel to go faster than the inner wheel. And clocks as well. I mean, that once modern clocks were developed, and this is a lot of the technology that went into that, that was hugely important for the scientific revolution and sort of the change in thinking that triggered all of that. So Arthur C. Clarke is basically saying, you know, they were on the verge of that. It took us 400 years to get from the Industrial Revolution to landing on the moon. So if they were there sort of 2,000 years ago, you know, imagine where we'd have got to if we had carried on that path. But apart from Arthur C. Clarke, nobody really paid that much attention to Derek Price. Everyone accepted his technical description of how it worked. But in terms of rewriting history or acknowledging the significance of the mechanism, no one paid that much attention. And I think it is because a lot of people couldn't understand his paper, and also it didn't really fit with, as I said, ideas of what the Greeks should have been able to do. There's this feeling that they're very good at sculpture, very good at philosophy, but not really, you know, they had a few little sort of technical toys that they played with, little sort of automata and things like that, but they didn't really get very far on a sort of practical technological path. So this didn't fit with that, so historians didn't really assimilate it into their knowledge. And it didn't help that Eric von Daniken, who wrote a lot of books arguing that ancient civilizations got a lot of their technology and religion from visiting aliens. He wrote about the Antikythera mechanism, and he thought that it was a navigational device on alien spaceships. And again, that helps to make the Antikythera mechanism a kind of oddball thing, not to really be taken seriously by the mainstream. It sort of gave them an excuse, really, not to pay that much attention to it. Derek Price died in 1983. He never published again on it. And this guy, Michael Wright, took over the work. He lives in Hammersmith. He was a senior curator at the Science Museum in London until he retired. And this is his workshop. This is actually one of the bedrooms in his lovely Edwardian home in Hammersmith. You can tell he's like he loves machines, mechanisms, geared mechanisms. He's a mechanic. He makes things from scratch. Very practical man. Does everything low tech. So, you know, he's got a traditional lathe here, and so everything's built using traditional techniques, and he's just very interested in how things are put together. And he came across Derek Price's work, and as somebody who kind of makes geared machines, when he looked at it, a lot of it just didn't make sense to him. So, for example, he was thinking, well, why would they invent something so impressive as a differential gear and then use it to calculate something so trivial as the phase of the moon, which you could easily calculate from scratch using just a couple of gear wheels. Medieval astronomical clocks from medieval times have little phase of the moon indicators, and it's done very simply with a couple of gear wheels, so you don't need a differential gear to do that. Also, that big four-spoked wheel, why is that so big? Because in Price's model, all it did was drive another little wheel around the same axis at the same speed, which then drove all the other gear trains from there. So it kind of seemed redundant. And also he thought that he saw on this big wheel like little brackets, as if other structures had once been held on this wheel. So there were lots of things saying to him, Price hasn't got the whole story here. So he went to Athens as well, spent several winters there. He kind of looked at the outside of it, but came upon the same problem that Price had, which is that in his X-rays, all of the gear wheels, it's sort of flattened. They all just appear in 1D. You know, you see all the gear wheels on top of each other, and you can't really tell what's at what depth. So it's very hard to work out exactly which gear wheels are engaging with what. So he knew that he would need to separate out the layers somehow. So he built from scratch a crude tomography machine, like a cradle, where you have the X-ray source, and then you have the fragment and the film, and you swing the fragment and the film together relative to the source. And what that does is it blurs most of the image, but apart from in one plane which stays in focus. And then you can set to which plane you want to be in focus. So you have to take a whole series of images so that different depths are in focus for each one. So it's very laborious, took about 5 years, hundreds and hundreds of images. So he came back, and he basically he had a different approach from Price, because he's a practical man. He just started building what he saw, and this is part of the insides of the model that he built with the four-spoke wheel. And he thought that what Price had missed was that this was really all about the planets. The planets as I'm sure most of you know, have very erratic motions through the sky as we see them from Earth, because they're not orbiting the Earth, they're orbiting the Sun. The Greeks didn't know that, of course, so their erratic path was sort of subject to a lot of consternation and mystery. A lot of their astronomy was trying to solve what on earth was going on with the planets, because they had this feeling that celestial cycles were divine, and divine motion was perfect motion. It was motion in a circle. So the idea of these erratic paths just didn't make any sense. So a pressing problem in philosophy and astronomy and a lot of these fields were all pretty much seen as this. They didn't really distinguish between these different fields at the time. So a real pressing problem was, how are they going to explain the motion of the planets using only circles? I'm sure most of you know a lot of this already. And the main theory at the time was epicycles. So this idea that planets, as well as going around the Earth in a circle, at the same time they're going around in a little epicircle. So sometimes they would seem to be going forwards, sometimes they would seem to be going backwards. And there's actually some truth in that, really, because what the planets as we see them, it's basically the planets orbit around the Sun. So that's one circle, well, close to a circle, ellipse, superimposed on our motion around the Sun. So it is kind of two roughly circles superimposed on another. So it wasn't sort of it's often ridiculed, but it wasn't actually that stupid an idea, and it wasn't a bad model for their motion. And then in astronomical clocks from medieval times, what Michael Wright knew was that this was often modelled using what's still called epicyclic gearing. So you have little gear wheels moving around on bigger gear wheels, and that models that little circle, going around a bigger circle. So he wondered whether similar epicyclic gearing could have been used in the Antikythera mechanism to model the motions of the planet. And so he sort of modelled this and came to the conclusion that this was indeed was the case. All of this is now missing, so none of those gear wheels survive. But I think most other experts that have looked at his work are now pretty convinced that even so he was correct, because we have inscriptions mentioning the names of the planets, and these brackets that he sees show that something was definitely going around on those other wheels. And this is just showing you the inside of his model, where he had lots of turntables fitted onto the front. And so you have, trying to see which would be a good example. So you have a wheel here. It's going around on this bigger wheel, and then there's a little peg sticking up from the little wheel, and it goes into this slotted lever, and that peg drives that lever, which is then attached to a pointer. So as that wheel goes round, sometimes it speeds up, sometimes it slows down, sometimes it goes backwards. And there's one of these for each of the 5 known planets at the time. So this is the front of Michael Wright's model of the Antikythera mechanism. So you can see there's the Sun and Moon pointer on there, as Derek Price had them, but also 5 extra planetary pointers. The back was a bit more tricky, so he realised that actually they weren't concentric dials on the back, they were spiral dials, which makes a bit more sense, because then you can have a sliding pointer that starts at the beginning, goes all the way around, and then gets reset. So it's a bit like a record stylus. And in fact, we now know that they were actually extendable pointers, exactly like a record stylus, with a little sort of, not quite a needle, but a little point that stuck down into the slot and then would have gone round. And Michael Wright also, these were divided into segments, and he counted the segments in the top one and worked out that there were 235 segments. So we've already come across the number 235. It's the number of synodic months in a 19-year metonic cycle. So he worked out that this was basically showing you the 19-year metonic cycle. So on the front, you're basically seeing what's happening throughout the year, and then on this dial on the back, you're seeing where you are in that 19-year cycle. And then when you get to the end of the 19-year cycle, you just lift the pointer up to there and put it back at the beginning, and you start a new one. The bottom spiral, he had a lot more trouble with. Most of it's actually missing in the surviving pieces of the Antikythera mechanism. So he wasn't able to count how many segments were going around, and most of the gearing leading to it was also lost. So he kind of fudged this. He didn't really know what this was doing. But there is a sort of bigger picture of his model. So you can see it's similar to the sort of scheme that Price had it. And he still has this in Hammersmith, and it's just a really lovely thing to look at. You can turn the handle, and then as you turn the handle, these pointers go around, and so they're not just going around at constant speed, they're actually sort of dancing forwards and backwards, as the planets would do. So that's as far as Michael Wright got. He had a couple of unanswered questions. So one of them was, well, they're all to do with this differential gear that Derek Price found. So Michael Wright realised that it wasn't actually a differential gear at all. It was a cluster of wheels being carried around on a turntable, but it wasn't 2 inputs, 1 output. It was 1 input, 1 output. So it was actually another example of epicyclic gearing. It wasn't a differential gear. But there were a couple of weird things about it. One of them was that the turntable had 223 teeth around its edge, but it didn't seem to be engaging with anything. And that's a lot of teeth to cut, especially when you're cutting them by hand, as the Greeks would have been, if you're not actually going to then use those for anything. So that was a mystery. And the other thing was that the cluster of gear wheels, Michael Wright realised that actually what was happening was you had one gear wheel on top of another gear wheel, these little wheels, the ones that were being carried around, with slightly different centres. And the bottom one had a pin sticking up, and it engaged with a little slot in the top one. So the pin in the bottom one, as that bottom wheel turned, was what was turning the top one. But because they had different centres, that pin was sliding towards and away from the centre of the top wheel. So the speed at which it was being driven was actually undulating. It was speeding up and slowing down. Kind of a sinusoidal motion. And Michael Wright had seen this before in astronomical clocks. They were often used to model the variations in speed of the sun and the moon. Because the sun and the moon aren't going, well, we're not going around the sun and the moon isn't going around us in a perfect circle. They're actually going around in an ellipse. So depending on whether so the moon, for example, depending on whether it's nearer to us, it looks as if it's going faster. When it's further away, it looks as if it's slowing down. And that's quite sophisticated. Like we did know that the Greeks, they didn't know that about the ellipse. You know, they were still convinced about circles, but they had epicyclic theories to try and describe this speeding up and slowing down. And this pin and slot mechanism is used in clocks for that. But again, Michael couldn't see where that was going to. You know, we already had a moon pointer on the front. This was part of a gear train that was leading to the back of the mechanism. He couldn't really make any sense of it. So there was hints there that there's a bit more going on, but he couldn't quite work out what these things were doing. Then this lot came along. So Michael Wright, loner, curator, uses traditional lathes, builds everything by hand, doesn't really publish what he's doing, just works completely on his own. And then now we've got an international team of scholars from all different countries, all different fields, using multi-million pound sort of state-of-the-art technology to image these fragments, sort of throwing money, technology, expertise, scientific authority, everything they've got at it. You can imagine how Michael Wright felt about that while he was still working on his X-rays in his little workshop. This team was led by this guy, Tony Freeth. He was actually a filmmaker in London originally, came across this thing, thought, oh, that'd be a great subject for a documentary, but realised that if he wanted to make a film about it, he was going to need some new results. He was going to need to know what this thing was. He wasn't aware of Michael Wright's work at the time. So he put together this whole team of Americans, Greeks, Brits, to try and image it. But he also realised that if he was going to get any further with it, they were going to need some pretty special technology. So they worked with a couple of different companies. This was Hewlett-Packard's contribution. It looks slightly mad. It was originally developed for making better computer graphics. So the way this works is these are 50 different flash bulbs, and they're wired to go off in sequence. So you get sort of a sequence of 50 flashes all in a row, and you have your object that you want to image here, and you have a camera here, which the shutter opens sort of 50 times, once for every flash. So it gives you 50 pictures of the same object, but in each image it's lit from a very slightly different direction. And you can feed those images into a computer, and it'll give you a virtual reconstruction of that object's response to light. So once you've got that reconstruction, you can sort of move the joystick or press buttons or whatever and basically ask for that object to be lit from any direction, and the computer can work it out. In fact, it can even light it from underneath if you want. It can light it from inside a tiny scratch if you want. You can do anything you like with it. So that was the kind of thinking behind getting more realistic computer graphics, because it's actually quite hard for things like material on hair or newspapers, you know, on these sort of, you know, on things like Second Life. It's actually quite hard to model how hair looks as you walk under a light, for example. So that's what this guy was hoping to do. But then he went to a talk about cuneiform tablets. These are these ancient stone tablets that Babylonians used to sort of press their letters into, and they're very rough, very eroded now. It's very hard to read. And he thought, well, hang on a second, my light dome would be brilliant for trying to work out, for getting a better view of that writing. And so he got in touch with the archaeologist. He was given the tablet to have a go on. And this was the result. So this is actually, a very rough, crumbly old stone tablet, barely readable. And what he's actually done here, as well as just playing around with the direction of the light, he said to the computer, okay, every pixel in this image, make it reflect light much, much more strongly than it would do normally. So it changes a rough, crumbly stone surface into a beautifully smooth, shiny surface. It looks like it's made of mercury or something. So you can see all sorts of things you couldn't see before. On the first tablet he looked at, he could actually see the thumbprint of the scribe. It sort of pressed into the clay when it was still wet. So really impressive. So Tony Freeth got in touch with this guy. It's called Tom Malzbender, who works at Hewlett-Packard in California. And this is what it did to a piece of the Antikythera mechanism. So this is the inscriptions on one of the sort of pieces of the surface to start off with, and then you make it much more reflective, and it's much, much more easy to read. So that's kind of well, I suppose that is quite low-tech, really. That's kind of just a thinking outside the box, really, approach to getting more information. And this was the real high-tech, let's just throw all the technology we can at it. This is a company called X-Tech, who are based in Tring in Hertfordshire, and they specialise in high-voltage microfocus X-ray imaging. High voltage just means very powerful X-rays, which you need. It just means that you can get better resolution and sort of penetrate through larger objects. And then microfocus means that the X-rays are coming from a very, very tiny source. So that means that you can image very, very tiny details because the resolution is very high. And they're pretty much the best at the world at combining those two things. So you've got very high power, very, very fine resolution. Even so, they did not have a machine that they felt was going to be good enough for imaging this thing. So they built one. And this is the one they used. It's called Blade Runner, and it was still a prototype when they used it to image the Antikythera fragments. So this weighs about 8 tons, and it had to be shipped to Athens in a lorry because the Greeks didn't want the Antikythera fragments to leave the museum. As well as the high power and fine resolution, they were actually using something called tomography, which is where you X-ray basically from every different angle, and then you feed all those images into a computer, and it gives you a 3D reconstruction, so you can fly through and just see everything that's inside. And this is that main fragment A again, being put into the machine for imaging. I can't actually show you any of the 3D X-ray images for copyright reasons, but this is just one of the flat X-rays that they took, and it's been sort of merged with a photograph of the main fragment, so you can kind of see how this fits underneath. You can't see much in this, but already you can see that this is much better quality than the images that Derek Price took originally. So in terms of the inscriptions, still quite fragmented, and they're still reading the inscriptions actually, so there's still probably quite a lot to come out of this. But this is some of the stuff that they read. How am I doing for time, by the way?
10 minutes.
Okay. The spiral divided into 235 sections. Now that's really nice because that confirms what Michael Wright had seen in that spiral dial divided into 235 months. So there you basically see it written, of confirmation of what he'd thought. They could see more signs of the zodiac around that front dial. They could see reference letters, which are basically, as the pointers are going around the front dial, it might hit a little alpha, a little beta, and then that's a reference letter that then takes you down to the star calendar text at the bottom. So you'd see an alpha, you'd go down and refer to the alpha at the bottom, and it'd tell you what the stars are doing at that time, which is quite nice. Venus, Mercury, so more references to the planets, and stationary points, which is where a planet sort of stops and changes direction. So again, that's supporting Michael Wright's idea that this was showing you the movement of the planets. Golden little sphere and little sphere are thought to refer to the sun and moon pointers. Trunnions, gnomon, perforations. This is thought to, these are just technical terms, so more operating instructions. And then the lower back dial, they actually found a new piece of the mechanism that was the main bit of the lower back dial. So that was, a hugely exciting discovery, and they were able to count the number of segments on that dial, and they were able to see these little collections of letters and numbers, which they call glyphs. Basically, they think this is all to do with eclipses. And this also solves Michael Wright's problems. Actually, I'll go back to here. So basically what they think this is doing, 223 is the number of segments on that spiral. And 223 is a very key number in another cycle, which is an eclipse cycle. Basically, eclipses repeat themselves pretty much exactly after 223 months or 18 years. So here you've got a spiral of 223 months, and they think that the glyphs were basically giving you information about solar and lunar eclipses and when they were going to happen, which month they were going to happen. It's giving you information about the timing and the characteristics of those eclipses, whether it's going to be day or night, what time it's going to happen, whether it's going to be solar or lunar, and possibly even more description than that. And then when you get to the end of your 223 months, you reset the pointer when you start it again. And then when they looked at the gearing, they realised that this 223 tooth turntable, they saw another little gear that was actually leading to that lower back dial. So that 223 teeth is helping in the gear train to calculate that 223 month cycle. But they found something else which they were pretty amazed by, which solves Michael Wright's other problem about this pin and slot. There was one gear before the 223 tooth turntable, 54 teeth, and one immediately after a 54 teeth, exactly cancelling out that first one. So why would you do that? Why would you change the speed of this turntable and then cancel it out immediately after? And they realised that this turntable is rotating once every 9 years. This is the one that's carrying this pin and slot mechanism, which we know would perfectly model the changing speed of the moon. And they realised that this is going around once every 9 years. Well, the ellipse of the moon's orbit actually shifts axis around the Earth once every 9 years. So what this is doing is not only modelling the change in speed of the moon, but it's actually modelling as that axis shifts by having that turntable moving around every 9 years. And then that motion was then being fed back to the lunar pointer on the front. So instead of going around at a constant speed, your moon pointer is actually changing speed exactly in time with this model of the moon's motion. So that's a pretty impressive thing to be doing with the moon's motion, but also the fact that this turntable has been doubled up. Not only is it helping to calculate the eclipse cycle, but they've given it a dual use. So it's also modelling beautifully the moon's motion. And there's what Tony Fries said about that. It's an absolutely unbelievably stunning and sophisticated idea. I don't know how they thought of it. We're just following in the tracks of the ancient Greeks. So there, you've seen this bit already. Here are the two spiral dials on the back. And this is just a diagram showing the gearing that exists. So this doesn't show any of the planetary stuff. If that was there, it would all be on the front, so it'd be much more complicated than this. But here's all the stuff, so wheel by wheel, what they have worked out what it's doing. Tony Fries organised, well, he published a paper in Nature in 2006 announcing all of this, and they organised that they were going to be the man who solved the Antikythera mechanism, which caused quite a lot of tension between the different people who were racing towards it. So he says, my employer forbade my research, so I've conducted it in my own time and at my own cost, in the face of professional and personal difficulties, intrigue, betrayal, bullying, injury, illness, loss of years of all my data, the long illness and death of my collaborator, and more. Even so, I am still here. He wanted everyone to know that even though this hotshot new team had come in, that he'd been working on it all the time and he'd got pretty much all of the answer before they did. So I'm just going to spend the last few minutes just talking about where this thing might have come from, what we know about that, and why they would have wanted a machine that could show you the motions of the sun, the moon, the planets through the heavens, that could predict eclipses, that could tell you about star calendars. What was that for? So a lot of the information comes from the ship that the Antikythera mechanism was found on and the other contents. And it was a Roman ship. It would have looked a bit like this. A Roman cargo ship. And it was basically, from the other things that were found on it, we know that it left from the Asian Minor coast, probably Pergamon, would have gone south, probably stopped off at Rhodes. This was a key trading post, so stopped there for supplies, and then was heading west. And it was almost certainly heading back to Rome. This was the 1st century BC, and the Romans were taking over the whole area. And especially Asia Minor. So they were basically just taking over all of the Greek colonies here, and they were extracting all the sort of booty and treasures they could find and sending them home to Rome. So this was a ship that was carrying that war booty back home, except that it didn't make it. It sank here where the sponge divers found it. Oh, I should say actually, Jacques Cousteau went back to the Antikythera Rex site in the 1970s, and he found quite a lot more stuff from there, including some coins from Pergamon and Ephesus, and they date from between 60 and 70 BC. So that gives us our sort of closest date for when the wreck went down. In terms of where this thing came from, what it was, we do have some clues in ancient texts. So this is Cicero, and he wrote, so he was a lawyer, an orator. He loved Greek philosophy. He was one of the greatest intellectual minds in ancient Rome, 1st century BC, so same time as the ship sailed. And he spent time on Rhodes, where we know the ship stopped off, studying with a philosopher there called Posidonius. And he wrote a couple of things. An instrument recently constructed by our friend Posidonius, which at each revolution reproduces the same motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets that take place in the heavens each day and night. So that sounds pretty familiar. Another one, the invention of Archimedes, deserved special admiration because he had thought out a way to represent accurately by a single device for turning the globe those various and divergent movements with their different rates of speed. So both of these, he's talking about, he says that they're bronze contrivances that are used to model the motions of the sun and the moon and the planets through the heavens. And these were never taken that seriously by historians because Cicero didn't have technical training. He didn't give any technical description of how these things worked. You know, he could have made them up to just for making a point. I mean, you can't tell just from something like that. But when you have the Antikythera mechanism and then you see these descriptions, you think, well, he's talking about the same thing. And Posidonius, in this first one, as I said, he's a philosopher on the island of Rhodes who was working there exactly when the Antikythera ship would have stopped there. Cicero went to see him there. So that's kind of quite a strong link there to the island of Rhodes, the idea that it could have come there, Posidonius could have been involved. This is Posidonius. But there's another link to Rhodes as well. Hipparchus, who's one of the greatest astronomers of the ancient world, he was the one who discovered the Earth's wobble on its axis. He developed some of the early principles of trigonometry. He made one of the, or possibly the first sort of comprehensive star catalogue. One of the other things he did was to develop a model of the moon's motion, so this variation in speed that I was telling you about, and he came up with equations to describe that. And those equations are basically exactly what is represented by that pin and slot mechanism. So it's his equation sort of perfectly represented in this, in these bronze gear wheels. So again, it's very, you can never know for certain who made things like this if they're not signed. You don't have the definitive evidence, but it looks as though his work is now being interpreted in this machine. And he was on Rhodes a bit before Posidonius in 2nd century BC. Fortunately, it's not quite that simple because there are some other lines of evidence that take us in a different direction. As I said, they're still reading the inscriptions, and some of the most recent stuff to come out of it is a little dial that's inside. So there's the 19-year Metonic cycle dial on the top of the back, and inside there's a little dial. And when they read it, they saw Isthmia, Olympia, Nemea, Pythia, Na. And these are names of, we've heard of the Olympic Games, but these are all names of pan-Hellenic games that were held in the Greek world. And so this is and they were all held on sort of 2 or 4 year cycles. So this is a 4-year dial that's telling you which games were to be held that year. So first of all, that's telling you that this wasn't just an astronomical tool. There's no astronomical interest really of this. So this was also had real social importance. It was something that was important to people in general, not just astronomers. And also they looked at the month names. So these 235 months, so they were repeated 19 times around this dial. These are the month names they read. And again, these are not month names from an astronomical calculator like the month names on the front. These are from a civic calendar. And different places in the Greek world use different month names, different orders of month names. So these are from a local calendar. Knowledge is quite patchy about exactly what months were used where, but one of the key contenders for where this calendar comes from is Syracuse in Sicily. That's where Archimedes lived and worked. And if you remember that other quote from Cicero, was talking about Archimedes. Now he lived too early, 3rd century BC, to have actually built this thing. This is more of a sort of late 2nd century BC thing. So he didn't make this particular machine. But again, that's sort of leading you towards Syracuse and Archimedes. And did he have something with perhaps initially inventing this kind of device? There's Archimedes. We don't know much actually about Archimedes' life, but one of the few biographical details we do know about him is that his father was an astronomer. So he could well have had interest in this kind of thing. We know that in terms of early gearwork in ancient Greece, as I said, not one single gear wheel survives, but we do know that they were using very crude techniques of using big gears to change sort of forces. So if you have a series of gear wheels, that are changing in size. You know, you can wind with a very small force and you end up pulling with a very large force a much smaller distance. And Archimedes definitely made devices like that. It's a far cry from the kind of mathematical gearing that we see in the Antikythera mechanism, but you know, we at least know he was working in this area. And also, one of the treatises, we have a list of titles of papers that he wrote. Some of them, we don't have the actual paper, we just have the title. One of them was called On Sphere Making. And we know that the ancients used the word sphere often to describe, to mean an astronomical model. So it's quite tempting to think, well, is that lost manuscript? Is that telling you how to make things like the Antikythera mechanism? So it could have been that Archimedes had a role in sort of inventing this principle of using gear wheels to model the heavens. And then, you know, over the next couple of hundred years, as astronomical sort of knowledge progressed, that's then being incorporated in the gear wheels. The gear work is getting more and more sophisticated to take that into account until you get to the 1st century BC. What was it used for? Some people think maybe an astrological device, because this would have been perfect for casting horoscopes, because you can turn the handle on the side and you can move forwards and backwards in time. You can see exactly the state of the sky, sun, moon, planets, everything that was happening for any particular date that you choose. So it would have been perfect. But there aren't any other sort of astrological writings on there, apart from the signs of the zodiac, which were used in astronomy anyway. And if you look at what Cicero and Posidonius would have been thinking, I think it's more likely that it was a philosophical or religious demonstration of the workings of the heavens. So Cicero talked about... the reason he wrote about this thing was because he was saying, look at this machine. Clearly, it had an intelligent creator. Somebody built this. So when you look at the actual universe, surely it must be clear that also somebody intelligent built that as well. It's kind of an early version of intelligent design. So it really had religious significance for him. Posidonius was a Stoic philosopher, and he didn't believe so much in a separate, distinct creator, but he believed that the whole cosmos was infused with a divine life force. So understanding the workings of that cosmos was a way of elevating the spirit, a way of getting closer to God, a sort of, you know, understanding the true nature of things. There's them seen again. Was this a one-off? Almost certainly not, partly because it was so sophisticated, it wasn't the first one that anyone made, and partly because so little survives from the ancient world. So if you look at statues, there were millions of these in ancient Greece. Now we'd have just a handful. So if you think about the stats, how likely is it that we were to have found one Antikythera mechanism? There couldn't have just been one originally. There must have been a lot more than that. Just what happened to the technology afterwards, very quickly, this is a sundial that was brought to the Science Museum in pieces. This is Michael Wright's reconstruction of it. It dates from 6th century AD, Byzantine Empire. It's a sundial. Lots of things have been found like this, but this is weird. This is a ratchet going around 7 days of the week, and actually it's linked to a geared calendar inside, which is showing you the moon and the sun and the zodiac, the phase of the moon, the day of the month. There's 8 gear wheels in there. Much more simple than the Antikythera mechanism, but it's the same principle. It's hundreds of years later, 6th century AD, Byzantine Empire. This is a manuscript that surfaced in 2005. This is 10th century Islamic. This is telling you how to make one of these geared calendars, exactly the same. Here are the sun and the moon and the zodiac, phase of the moon. So this has now passed, this knowledge has passed through to the Islamic world. 12th century AD, this is an Islamic astrolabe now in Oxford. Beautiful, but looks pretty normal from the front. From the back, sun and the moon and the zodiac, phase of the moon, day of the month. Exactly the same geared calendar inside it. Going the wrong way. So there you can see the gears inside. So although they weren't able to build on this technology, certainly sort of elements of it, the principle survived. We know a lot of knowledge then came back from the Islamic world to medieval Europe. And we have, this is the astronomical clock in Prague, this is 14th century AD. And it's exactly the same. This predicts eclipses, it shows you the positions of the sun and the moon and the planets, dates of different feasts. Telling the time is almost incidental, and that's a real mystery with the invention of clocks, because they suddenly appeared, this is the last slide. They suddenly appeared all over Europe, all at the same time, like this, like huge, sophisticated astronomical display pieces. It was only later that clocks got smaller and more simple and became about telling the time. And that's not how technological development is supposed to work. It's meant to get simpler and get more complex. And what seems to have happened is that a lot of this technology was kind of waiting dormant from the Antikythera mechanism. This idea of using gear wheels to model the motions of the heavens was just really waiting for someone to invent a mechanical escapement. And when they did, it all got brought together, and suddenly you had these amazing clocks appearing everywhere. So the price was right. There was like a single line from the Antikythera mechanism right through to the watches that we're wearing on our wrists today. And I've written a book about it.